She thought it was only a small act of kindness, a poor black tailor fixing the torn suit of a stranger who looked powerful, distant, untouchable. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. But before the sun rose the next morning, her quiet little shop was surrounded by unfamiliar cars, sealed papers, and men who looked at her like she had committed a crime. In one night, kindness became danger, and the life she had spent decades stitching together began to unravel in silence. She had survived poverty, hunger, and being invisible her entire life, but she was not prepared for what kindness would cost her. One decision, one free repair, and suddenly her name was being spoken in places she had never entered by people who never wanted to know her truth. By sunrise, her safety was gone. By the end of the week, so was her future. This is not just her story. It is what happens when race and power decide who deserves to be protected. Subscribe for real stories that expose the truth most people are afraid to talk about. Before everything changed, her life moved in patterns so quiet most people never noticed they existed. The city rushed around her, loud, impatient, but she lived inside a smaller rhythm, shaped by thread fabric and the slow passing of hours. Every morning, before sunlight reached the cracked sidewalks, she unlocked the narrow door of her tailoring shop and stepped into the same familiar stillness. The air always carried the soft scent of cloth and dust, mixed with the faint memory of steam from an old iron, one that had outlived its warranty by decades. The shop was small, pressed between a closed barber store and a convenience shop that changed owners every year. Its sign had faded so badly some letters were barely readable, as if time itself were erasing her name from the street. The window held two mannequins, dressed in simple clothes she had sewn by hand long ago. Their plastic faces, pale, expressionless, staring into traffic that never looked back. Inside, everything had its place. Spools of thread arranged by color, even the ones nearly empty. Scissors resting beside folded measuring tapes. Pins sleeping inside a chipped porcelain cup that once belonged to her mother. And the sewing machines old, but loyal, waiting like quiet animals that only moved when her hands commanded them. She had learned order because disorder was expensive. Mistakes cost money. Waste cost food. Carelessness cost rent. So she became careful with everything, especially herself. In this part of the city, being a poor black woman meant learning how to take up as little space as possible. It meant walking with eyes lowered, voice soft, shoulders slightly curved forward, as if apologizing for existing. It meant knowing when to speak, and when silence would keep you safer. It meant understanding that respect was not given freely, but something you tried to earn from people who had already decided you were worth less. Her childhood had taught her that. So had every job interview that ended too quickly. Every store where security followed her down the aisles. Every office where her words were met with polite smiles and quiet disbelief. By the time she opened her own shop, invisibility felt natural. She did not complain. Complaints attracted attention. Attention attracted trouble. Instead, she focused on work. Work was honest. Work did not ask questions. Work rewarded effort, even if the reward was small. She had inherited her skill from women whose names history never bothered to record. A grandmother who sewed dresses for families who would never invite her inside their homes. A mother who stitched uniforms until her fingers cracked, then stitched them again the next morning. They taught her that fabric remembered hands, that stitches carried stories, that even when the world refused to see you, your work could still exist as proof that you had been here. So she worked. She repaired torn coats in winter, hemmed school uniforms for children who grew too fast, adjusted wedding dresses for brides who barely looked at her face, fixed cheap suits and expensive ones, Though expensive clients rarely crossed into her neighborhood, most days business was slow. Some days no one came at all. On those days, she sat by the window repairing old garments just to keep her hands moving, pretending the sound of traffic was enough to fill the silence. Money arrived unevenly, like rain in a drought. She learned how to stretch it, how to eat simple meals, how to walk instead of ride, how to reuse thread too thin for comfort, how to sleep with worry folded quietly inside her chest. Yet despite everything, she believed in one small idea that had survived all the disappointments of her life. That kindness mattered, not the loud kind that made people famous, not the kind that came with cameras or speeches, but the small, quiet kind, the kind that knew no one would notice and no one would protect it, the kind no one rewarded, the kind no one defended, the kind that made her fix buttons without charging extra, stay late when someone looked desperate, or refuse money from people who clearly needed it more than she did. It was not bravery, it was habit. It was how she had been taught to remain human in a world that treated her like a shadow. The city around her told a different story. A few miles away, glass buildings reflected the sky like polished mirrors. Restaurants served meals that cost more than her weekly rent. Cars passed her street carrying people who had never worried about choosing between electricity and groceries. Billboards promised luxury, safety, success, futures that did not include people like her. That distance had always existed. She accepted it the way people accept weather unfair, unstoppable, permanent. On the afternoon before everything began to unravel, nothing felt unusual. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with unshed rain. The street outside her shop buzzed with tired life. Buses exhaling smoke, shoes slapping pavement. Someone laughing too loudly at nothing important. She worked alone, as she usually did, repairing a jacket whose fabric had thinned with age. Her hands moved automatically, guided by muscle memory older than her doubts. She did not know. This ordinary day was already standing at the edge of something dangerous. She did not know. The man who would soon walk into her shop carried a name powerful enough to erase hers. She did not know the simple kindness she would offer would be measured, examined, twisted, and repackaged into something that could destroy her. At that moment, she only knew the comfort of routine, the soft hum of her sewing machine, the gentle weight of fabric in her lap, the quiet belief that tomorrow would look like today. That belief had kept her alive. It had carried her through sickness, eviction notices, empty refrigerators, and nights when the city outside sounded like it was celebrating a future that did not include her. It told her dignity could survive poverty. Effort could outlast injustice. That doing the right thing still meant something, even if no one applauded. She closed her shop later that evening with the same care she always did, wiping the counters, covering the machines, counting the few bills in her drawer twice to be sure. Outside, the sky finally released its rain. It washed the streets in silver lines, blurring neon lights and traffic into trembling reflections. She stood under the doorway for a moment, listening to water strike concrete, breathing in the damp air, unaware that this sound, this moment, this version of her life was already becoming a memory. She locked the door, she walked home, she slept. And somewhere, far beyond her neighborhood, plans were already forming around her name, her hands, her shop, her future. Plans she would never be invited to understand. Plans that did not care how carefully she had lived. Plans that would turn her kindness into evidence, and her existence into a problem. The next morning felt wrong, before anything visible confirmed it. The air carried a tension she could not explain, thick, unmoving, as if the street itself were holding its breath. When she turned the corner toward her shop, she slowed, without knowing why. Her steps became careful. measured. The familiar cracked sidewalk suddenly looked unfamiliar, as though it had been rearranged overnight by hands that did not belong to her world. Then she saw them. Black vehicles lined the street like quiet animals waiting to be unleashed. Their windows were dark, polished to the point of reflection, hiding whatever sat inside. They did not belong here. Nothing this expensive ever paused in her neighborhood, unless it was lost or broken. Her heart began to pound, slow, heavy, each beat louder than her thoughts. She told herself to keep walking. She told herself she was imagining danger. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. But her body did not believe her. Men stepped onto the sidewalk as she approached. Their movements controlled, efficient, confident in a way only people backed by money and authority ever were. Their clothes too clean, their posture too straight, their eyes too practiced at measuring worth. She unlocked her shop with fingers that no longer felt fully connected to her hands. The bell rang above her door, thin, fragile. Inside, her small world was instantly invaded. They moved through her space as if it already belonged to them. Their attention cold, professional, sliding over shelves, counters, machines, notebooks, every object she had touched with care. The room that once felt safe now felt exposed, stripped, inspected. Her chest tightened, her breath shortened. She tried to explain what little she understood, but explanations felt powerless against the weight of their presence. Papers appeared. Requests, demands, timelines she did not recognize. Words she did not understand written down as if they were truths. Then she remembered the suit, the heavy fabric, the fine stitching, the urgency with which she had repaired it, the way she had refused payment, sensing exhaustion in the man who wore wealth like armor. At the time, it had felt simple. Now, it felt like a crime scene. Outside, people began to gather. Neighbors who had known her for years slowed their steps. Some stared openly. Some pretended not to notice. Some whispered. Phones appeared briefly in hands, then disappeared again. She recognized the pattern instantly. Authority attracts suspicion. Suspicion demands a story, and the easiest story was always the same. A poor black woman, a powerful white billionaire. Money, manipulation, greed, crime. It did not matter that none of it was true. It only mattered that it sounded believable to people who had never needed proof to doubt her. By midday, the street felt hostile. Her shop window reflected faces that no longer looked neutral. They looked curious, cautious, judging. By evening, the rumors had grown teeth. Someone said she tried to blackmail him. Someone said she planted something in the suit. Someone said she damaged it on purpose. Someone said she had been planning this for years. The story changed shape with every mouth that carried it, but it always returned to the same conclusion. She must have done something wrong, because people like her always did. Her phone stopped ringing. Suppliers who once greeted her warmly let calls fade into silence. A landlord's message arrived, cold, careful, asking questions he had never cared about before. Then the bank notification appeared. Accounts temporarily restricted, funds under review. No timeline, no explanation, just emptiness where her safety used to be. She sat alone in her shop that night, surrounded by half-finished garments that no longer felt real. The sewing machines were silent. The walls felt thinner. Every sound outside made her flinch. She tried to calculate how long she could survive, how many days of rent remained, how many meals she could skip, how long before the lights went out. She had done nothing wrong, yet punishment was already unfolding around her, efficient and quiet. The following days blurred into one long stretch of fear. Officials returned again and again, each time removing more certainty from her life. Her notebooks were photographed, her receipts copied, her tools inspected, her privacy peeled away layer by layer. No one explained what would happen next. No one told her how to defend herself. No one treated her like a person caught in confusion. They treated her like a problem that needed organizing. She stood in the corner of her shop while strangers touched the objects that had once defined her days. The machines that had carried her survival, handled without care, photographed without understanding, reduced to numbered items on paper. Every drawer opened felt like a question she was not allowed to answer. Every camera flash felt like a small verdict. She watched them move through her life as if it were already finished, already cataloged, already decided. The walls that once protected her now echoed with unfamiliar footsteps. The counters that once held folded fabric now held documents she could not read fast enough to understand. No one looked at her hands. No one asked how long it took to build something so fragile. No one paused long enough to see the woman standing behind the evidence. Hours passed without shape. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon faded into a dull, aching gray. Each visit ended the same way, silence replacing motion. Her still standing in the middle of a room that felt less like a shop and more like a crime scene that had forgotten its victim. She began to understand. Explanations were no longer useful. Truth was no longer heavy enough to compete with paperwork. Her life had entered a process that did not require her participation, only her disappearance. And when they finally left, the quiet that followed was worse than their presence. It pressed against her ears, it filled her chest. It made the familiar space feel foreign. The shop was still standing, but it no longer belonged to her in any way that mattered. Outside, the neighborhood changed its posture toward her. A woman who once brought her tea crossed the street. A man who owed her money avoided her window. Parents pulled children closer when they passed her door. Her name became something people spoke carefully, quietly, as if it carried contamination. She felt it settling into her bones. Shame, not for what she had done, but for how easily the world accepted she must have done something. At night she barely slept. Her mind replayed every detail of the repair. The moment she chose kindness, the moment she refused payment, the way she smiled politely, expecting nothing. She searched for mistakes that did not exist. Her chest hurt constantly. Her hands trembled even when resting. Food lost its taste, time lost its structure, and still no explanation arrived, only pressure, only silence, only the steady tightening of invisible hands around her future. She walked the same streets she had walked for years, but now every step felt heavier, measured, watched. Conversations stopped when she passed. Doors closed faster than before. Familiar faces turned unfamiliar in the space of a single rumor. She learned how quickly belonging could be withdrawn, how fast safety could become suspicion, how easily a life could be reduced to a version of itself that no longer resembled the truth. She no longer looked into windows. She no longer lingered in doorways. She no longer allowed herself to be seen unless necessary. The city had not changed. Only her place inside it had. And in that shrinking space, between who she had been and who the world now decided she was, something essential began to collapse quietly without witnesses. Not her body, not her breath, but her certainty that she was still allowed to exist without explanation. She learned that the billionaire's legal team had categorized her actions as suspicious interference. The phrase followed her everywhere, in documents, in whispers, in the careful distance people kept from her. Suspicious, interference, as if her existence itself had disrupted something sacred, as if her hands had violated a boundary wealth alone was allowed to cross. She stood one afternoon behind her counter, watching dust drift through sunlight, wondering when her shop had turned into evidence, wondering when her life had become something other people were permitted to rearrange. She realized then truth was no longer important. only narrative, and the narrative had already chosen its hero and its villain, and it was not her story to tell anymore. Another notice arrived, then another. Deadlines, reviews, temporary closures. Words designed to sound neutral while removing everything that kept her standing. She felt smaller each day, as if the walls of her world were closing in, not violently but carefully, politely, legally. She began packing small items into boxes without knowing why. Buttons, old receipts, scraps of fabric she could not throw away. It felt like preparing for a storm she could not see, only sense, the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground moves. One evening, she locked her shop and rested her forehead against the glass. Her reflection looked unfamiliar, older, hollow, tired in a way sleep could not repair. She remembered believing that kindness mattered, that work mattered, that being good might protect her from being destroyed. Now she understood how fragile that belief had always been. The world had never promised fairness. It had only pretended to, and she had believed it because believing was easier than surviving without hope. That hope was dissolving now, quietly, like thread burning away under heat. And she could feel something worse approaching. Not rumor, not investigation, not suspicion, but something final, something permanent, something designed to leave no room for misunderstanding. She stood outside the courthouse one morning, watching expensive cars glide past stone steps polished by history. She was not allowed inside the rooms where her future was being decided. She was only allowed to be affected by them. Inside, men in tailored suits spoke of her as risk, as possibility, as liability. Outside, she stood alone, holding a folder of documents she barely understood, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. She realized then this was the moment, not the investigation, not the rumors, not the frozen bank account. The understanding that nothing she said would change the outcome. That truth had already been replaced by convenience. That justice had already chosen its direction. She felt anger rise, hot, sharp, brief, then disappear under something heavier. Exhaustion, a grief too large for tears. She sat alone on a wooden bench while men in tailored suits filled the room with quiet confidence. Papers changed hands, decisions were affirmed, timelines extended, investigations formalized, all without her understanding more than fragments of what was happening to her life. The courtroom did not see a tailor, it saw a risk. A story was chosen, and once chosen, it was protected. She felt something tear inside her that had nothing to do with fear. It was the slow death of belief. Belief that effort mattered. Belief that truth had weight. Belief that goodness could survive contact with power. She realized then, the outcome had been decided the moment she touched that expensive fabric. The moment her hands, marked by years of invisible labor, altered something belonging to someone untouchable. She was never on trial for what she did. She was on trial for who she was. Outside, reporters gathered. Cameras waited. Headlines prepared themselves like weapons. Her name would soon be stitched into narratives she did not control. A warning disguised as news. A lesson wrapped in legality. When she finally left the courthouse, the air felt unfamiliar, heavy, hostile. She walked through it as if underwater, each step slow, distorted, unreal. Her reflection passed in dark windows, a woman carrying nothing, not even certainty. The end did not arrive in chaos. It arrived quietly, with documents, with signatures, with decisions made in rooms where her name was spoken without her presence. The notice came early in the morning, folded neatly inside an official envelope that felt heavier than it should have. She opened it slowly, standing in the doorway of her shop, reading words that blurred together, even as her hands steadied the paper. Temporary seizure of property, suspension of business operations. Assets under legal control pending investigation. The language was clean, professional, merciless. By noon, men returned to her street, not the same ones as before, more official, more distant, more final. They placed notices on her windows, red tape across her door, small legal warnings that might as well have been gravestones. She stood on the sidewalk as they worked, arms wrapped around herself, watching her life be reorganized into a legal problem. No shouting, no violence, no scene dramatic enough for news cameras, just procedure, and that was worse. Her neighbors gathered again, this time in silence. Some looked sorry, some looked relieved, some looked satisfied. None stepped forward. None asked if she was okay. None questioned whether this was fair. They had already accepted the story. The poor black woman had done something wrong. The powerful man had been wronged. Order was being restored. Her shop, the place where she had spent more time than anywhere else on earth, was entered without her. Her sewing machines were rolled out like broken furniture. Her boxes were labeled, her shelves emptied, her notebooks sealed. Years of careful labor reduced to inventory. She tried to speak. Her voice came out thin, unconvincing, already outdated. No one listened. She felt something collapse inside her chest, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, like a building whose foundation had been quietly removed. By evening, her shop was no longer hers. Not even in spirit, it was evidence, property, a location in a case file. She walked away with only what fit in one small bag, a sweater, some documents, a few personal items. Her hands felt useless without fabric. Empty. Wrong. The following days erased her even further. Her landlord informed her the lease was void. Her frozen accounts remained frozen. Her phone filled with automated warnings. No human voice ever arrived with them. She tried to find legal help. The numbers she called placed her on hold for hours, then days, then never. Lawyers cost more than her entire life savings. Advice cost dignity. Everything cost money she no longer had. And still the narrative grew. The Billionaire's legal team released statements, careful, strategic. They described her as an unknown individual who had interfered with private property. They spoke of potential security threats. They spoke of financial motives. They spoke of necessary precautions. They never spoke of kindness. They never spoke of truth. They never spoke of her. She learned from a stranger that the suit had never been damaged beyond repair. It had been perfect, but perfection did not matter. Control did. The case moved forward without her, paper after paper, decision after decision, each one pushing her further from the life she once knew. Her case never reached trial. It did not need to. A quiet settlement was arranged between powerful people. Her shop would remain closed permanently. Her assets would be absorbed. No admission of wrongdoing would be recorded. No apology would be issued. The matter would be considered resolved. She received nothing, no compensation, no explanation, no chance to defend herself. Just a finality. That night, she slept on a borrowed mattress in a room that smelled like strangers. She stared at the ceiling, listening to unfamiliar sounds, understanding she had crossed into a life she had never prepared for, a life where survival no longer included purpose, only endurance. She stood one evening across the street from her old shop. The windows were dark. The sign had been removed. The familiar shape of the door looked smaller than she remembered, as if it already belonged to another story, another future, one that did not include her. Her knees weakened. She sat on the curb, pressing her hands against her face, trying to remember what safety felt like, trying to remember the sound of her sewing machine, trying to remember who she had been before kindness became evidence. Cars passed, people passed, life continued. No one stopped. No one recognized her. The city had already replaced her. She thought of her mother, of her grandmother, of the hands that taught her how to sew, how to work, how to be proud, even when the world refused to be kind. She wondered what they would think now, of a system that did not need chains to destroy, only paperwork. She realized what had been taken from her was not just a business, not just money, not just stability, but belief. Belief that doing good could protect you. Belief that honesty mattered. Belief that the world would see her if she lived carefully enough. That belief was gone, replaced by knowledge. Knowledge that race could turn kindness into threat. That poverty could be rewritten as motive. That power could erase a life without raising its voice. And as she lay there in the dark listening to the city breathe without her, one final understanding settled into her bones, heavier than fear. This was never about a suit. It was never about damage. It was never about the truth. It was about reminding the world who was allowed to be innocent and who was not. And somewhere far away in a tower of glass and money, the man whose suit she had fixed slept peacefully, untouched by the destruction that carried his name. While she lay awake, with nothing left but her hands and a life rewritten by a system that had never planned to let her win. She did not disappear, but the life she had known did. Days turned into weeks, weeks folded into months, each one quieter than the last. The city continued moving at its usual speed, loud, confident, while she learned how to exist in its shadows. She rented a narrow room at the edge of town, in a building where people did not ask questions, because everyone was already carrying too many of their own answers. The room was barely large enough to stretch her arms. One window, one light, one thin mattress. It was safe. That was all she could afford to hope for now. Her hands still woke early, shaped by decades of routine. Every morning before her mind remembered what had been taken, her fingers twitched, searching for fabric that was no longer there. Sometimes she reached toward empty air, expecting the familiar weight of cloth, the quiet vibration of a sewing machine beneath her palms. Then reality returned. Slow, heavy, unforgiving, she tried to find work. Tailoring shops in better neighborhoods never called her back. Some smiled politely during short interviews. Some ended conversations as soon as they saw her address. Some did not hide their discomfort at all. Her name, once harmless, now carried something invisible but permanent: suspicion, risk, complication. She found occasional work cleaning offices at night, moving silently through hallways lined with framed awards and photographs of people who would never know her story. She wiped desks where contracts were signed. She emptied trash bins filled with drafts of speeches about integrity, about leadership. She polished glass walls that reflected her face back at her, tired, thinner, a stranger shaped by quiet loss. The money was small, enough to survive, not enough to rebuild. She stopped telling people what had happened. At first, she tried, but the look she received taught her to keep the story folded inside her chest, like a fragile letter no one wanted to read. Some listened with sympathy that ended too quickly. Some offered advice that blamed her without meaning to. Some asked questions, searching for the mistake she must have made. Eventually, she learned silence was easier. Silence did not argue. Silence did not require proof. Silence did not ask her to relive what had already carved itself into her bones. Her old neighborhood forgot her quickly. The shop was replaced within a year. Different sign, different colors, different name. People walked past, never knowing what had been there before, never imagining the quiet life stitched into those walls. The billionaire's world remained untouched. His companies expanded. His name appeared in magazines beside words like visionary, philanthropist. His image softened with carefully planned generosity. No article mentioned the woman whose life had been folded into footnotes. No headline spoke her name. No correction ever arrived. The system had closed its book on her story, but her story did not close inside her. It lived in small things. In the way she flinched when expensive cars slowed nearby. In the way her stomach tightened at the sight of official envelopes. In the way her hands shook slightly when someone spoke too formally. In the way she hesitated before helping strangers, measuring the cost of kindness, before allowing it to exist. The world had taught her that goodness could be dangerous, that generosity could be misunderstood, that innocence could be rewritten. And so she became careful in a new way, not cautious of hunger, not cautious of loneliness, but cautious of being visible. Years passed. The sharp pain softened into something duller but deeper, a quiet ache that never fully left. She grew older, her hair grayed, lines gathered around her eyes shaped by worry more than time. Sometimes, on rare evenings, when exhaustion loosened her defenses, she allowed herself to remember the shop, the smell of fabric, the sound of thread pulling tight, the small pride of finishing work no one else would ever notice. She remembered believing her hands mattered. She remembered believing her effort counted. She remembered believing she was safe. That belief had been expensive, too expensive. Her story is not rare. It does not belong only to her. It belongs to the cashier followed through aisles, to the tenant evicted, because silence is easier than fairness, to the worker blamed, because power needs someone small to carry its mistakes, to families whose names vanish from records while corporations remain clean. It belongs to people whose lives are dismantled quietly, legally, professionally, without bruises, without headlines, without justice. This is how racism survives in modern clothing, not always loud, not always violent, but precise, organized, signed in ink, approved in meetings, explained with words that sound reasonable to those who will never pay the price. It does not need hatred in the open. It only needs permission in private. It only needs assumptions written into systems. It only needs silence from those who are comfortable. And silence is easy. It is easy to believe these stories are rare, easy to call them unfortunate, easy to say the system is complicated, easy to look away. Harder is to accept the system often works exactly as designed, protecting power, sacrificing the invisible, rewarding those who already have everything, and teaching the rest to be careful with their kindness. She never received her shop back. She never received an apology. She never received her name cleared, but she is still here, breathing, working, existing in a world that tried to fold her into nothing. And that alone is a kind of quiet resistance. Her hands, though older, still remember how to mend, how to repair, how to create something whole from what is torn. Perhaps one day the world will learn to do the same. Perhaps one day kindness will no longer be treated as a threat when it comes from the wrong skin. Perhaps one day justice will not depend on wealth. Perhaps one day stories like hers will no longer be ordinary. But until then they will continue, quietly, endlessly, unnoticed by those who benefit from forgetting. Now her story lives with you, in your memory, in your choices, in the way you see the next person who stands alone against a powerful system, in the way you question the version of truth handed to you wrapped in authority, because injustice does not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it signs papers, sometimes it closes a small shop on a quiet street and calls it procedure. So when you hear about a life ruined without scandal, when you see a business disappear overnight, when you are told someone must have done something wrong, remember her hands. Remember her silence. Remember what kindness cost her, and ask yourself, how many more lives will be carefully dismantled before this stops being normal? And if the answer is too many, what will you do differently now that you know? She walks now where no one is waiting, no shop to open, no machine to wake, no window that remembers her hands, only streets that have learned how to forget. The city moves around her as it always has, fast, loud, certain of its own importance. Cars pass without slowing, faces blur without looking back, buildings rise where stories fall apart, and somewhere inside that motion, her footsteps remain soft, almost apologetic, as if the world still expects her to justify her existence. She carries nothing that can be proven, no documents that restore her name, no records that return her dignity, no evidence strong enough to outweigh power. Only memory, only hands that still remember how to make broken things whole. And sometimes, in the quiet between one step and the next, she wonders what her life might have been if kindness had not been treated like a threat, if her skin had not been read as motive, if poverty had not been mistaken for guilt. She wonders how many other lives have been folded into silence the same way. How many doors have closed without noise? How many dreams have been erased with clean signatures? How many people are walking right now with their futures quietly taken from them, while the world calls it policy, procedure, business as usual? Her story does not end with justice. It ends with survival. And survival in a world like this is not weakness. It is resistance. So when you leave this story, when the screen goes dark and when her face fades from view, remember, she is still walking somewhere, still breathing in a world that tried to erase her, still carrying the cost of kindness in her bones. Because this was never just her story. It is the story of what happens when power decides who deserves protection and who must become a warning. She touched a billionaire's suit, and the system erased her life. Before you go, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your state or even your country in the comments. And tell us, how did this story make you feel? We'd love to know how far her story has traveled and how many hearts it reached today. This was just one of countless untold stories, from lives shaped by race, silence, and survival. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Subscribe to Black Story Chronicle as we continue to uncover the stories the world tried to ignore and give a voice to those who were never meant to be heard.